Well, thank you all for joining us this morning. I'm pretty excited to have this conversation. I think, George, is something that you and I have spent many hours over the years talking about, but it's kind of great to share it, with the world. And one idea behind this webcast series has been to take conversations that we might have at a bar and um, you know kind of rehash that conversation and structure it so that it's a little bit more of a clear takeaway. But homebrew is something that's a very big passion of mine personally, and White Labs, and obviously yours. And I think we get so focused on home brewing and the home brewer. We take for granted the homebrew shop, right? And the resources that you guys offer and that you've built um, over the last couple of years. So I'm excited to dive into it. But the title of this one, I think, is fitting. What every homebrew shop wants you to know. What would make your life easier, and in return make our beer better. So my name is Eric Fowler. I'm the Education and Brewery Experience Manager at White Labs. George, did you want to introduce yourself, homebrewer, homebrewing co, and where you
Yeah.
guys are located?
Yeah. The Homebrewer was founded in 2012 in North Park in San Diego. And then in like 2014, 2015, we added Home Brewing Co., which was like in California, the license is a type 23. So a small beer manufacturer with the idea of doing quality beers that maybe showcase some of the ingredients that we like playing with, maybe some process, share the recipes, use it as like a conversation starter with either avid home brewers or beginners or people who had no idea you can make beer at home. And then some of the stuff we're proud of is 2018 we got the Homebrew Shop of the Year award from the American Homebrewers Association, and then in San Diego, the Reader polls, we do really well on those like favorite homebrew shops and stuff. But yeah, I've been brewing for about 18-ish years as a home brewer, and have a background in history, have a master's in history, and turned that somehow into talking about beer. And I also am an instructor with the SDSU Business of Craft Beer, and their two of their courses, one on beer styles, a lot of history, tasting, and then also one on just the overview of the beer making process.
Awesome, and I've appreciated guest lecturing that class before.
Yeah.
So hopefully we can come back and
Yeah.
as things start up again, share some beer and some spikes.
Yeah.
So we'll get through what we're going to talk about today, but maybe you could briefly describe like who your customers are. Like, who do you usually see coming into the shop? Is it having a tasting room too, and an education focused tasting room in a very prominent craft beer area in North Park of San Diego?
Mhm.
Like, who usually are you seeing walking through your doors? Of people that already have their mind made up whether they're going to brew and what they're going to brew, or are you seeing a lot of converts and bringing them to the brewing side, to the hot side?
Yeah, I'd say we see all of it. We're definitely in a tourist destination. There's a lot of craft breweries and restaurants in the North Park neighborhood, so we get a lot of people coming in from out of town just for that, and they're kind of walking in here kind of with like, all right, what is this place? It's, looks like a hardware store, but there's taps on the wall. So we try to make it look clean and welcoming for everybody. But so we get the people who didn't really know you could homebrew, or maybe they've heard of that, but they're really here just to kind of try the beers because someone in the neighborhood told them to stop by. And then we get the diehard homebrew fans or homebrewers who know exactly what they're looking for. We get the brand new ones, the newbies, I guess. Maybe they've heard that we have a good reputation for treating people really nicely and being, really like easy going with teaching people the process. So we have a reputation for that. But we really see it all. We do get some converts, people just kind of sitting around, like they're sitting there drinking their beer and they're looking at all this stuff and they're like, what is all that? And you start going into it, and you might see them back in a week or two to grab that starter kit. And that's really fun and cool, because you kind of see them, you see the light bulbs kind of start going off.
Mm-hmm.
And then, yeah, we have people who've been brewing for 20, 30 years, and they like what we offer and the selection. So they just like to come in and talk shop and and we love them all.
Awesome. Yeah, I think, the shop that you guys have built has been great, and how you're always continuing to, adapt the space and make it more inviting and friendly. And I think, Sid, you think that the days when we started homebrewing, and a lot of these shops still exist, but shops that can be a little intimidating to walk into, are covered in dust from their mill, and don't necessarily see like it's the most accessible, tucked away in a shopping center somewhere, unless you know what you're looking for. And from my perspective, it's kind of seemed like you've done the opposite of that and tried to modernize what the retail space looks like.
Yeah, and thank you. Because we try to have a mindset of looking at like really successful retailers like Apple or Zara or and look at how they organize their spaces, and then apply that to the homebrew store. And it's a challenge because you have 1,000 SKUs in here and everything's a different shape and size. So it's not easy making things look pretty. But we want that idea of, you kind of look through and kind of get a sense of, even if you had no idea what homebrewing was, you can kind of see how it works. And then we just try to be really welcoming, like right out the gate, and try to be really casual. When I was learning how to homebrew and I was just getting really obsessed with it, and was like, all I thought about, all I wanted to read about, all I wanted to do was homebrew. And, I'd have some experiences walking into a shop where it was like the person would recognize me and be like, "Hey, what's up, man?" And I'm like, "Cool. All right." I'm getting in. And then like, if I like shaved my beard or cut my hair, then like the next time it'd be like, "What do you want?" And you're like, "Oh man, I lost it. I lost my repertoire. Now I got to like rebuild it." And that was like really disheartening to me. Maybe I'm too sensitive and I take stuff too personally, but I really like, I'm not an extrovert. And so for me, like any human interaction is pretty draining for me. And so I really appreciate when I have like pleasant, like nice interaction. So that's really what we're trying to do here. And I think people really respond to that. And sometimes we'll hear, I went to this other place and people were kind of like mean to me. It's like, oh, that's a bummer. We'll never say anything bad about any other shop, but it's just a different style of like.
Yeah, I think it's a mentality, and as as e-commerce has picked up, those community hubs have higher standards, right? Because people don't have to go to them anymore. You can get anything delivered to your house, and the added value is part of that community. And I think you guys have done a great job, and even just acknowledging it, I think is a step in the right direction, because we could start talking about inclusivity in general. And when it's a hobby and not something people need, a grocery store, people have to go to the grocery store and they have to buy those products. Homebrewing is something out of passion they're spending a lot of time and a lot of money and resources on. So if you're turning people off of that, they're just going to leave the hobby in general. So, we'll kind of break down more specifics from your perspective, from ingredients to process, and then probably everybody's, favorite part of it is the actual tasting and the finishing the product. Let's first talk about, breaking down ingredients a little bit further, but malt and hops. We can start with, different types of grain.
Yeah.
I think it's interesting, primarily we're working with, malted barley, but there's unmalted grains, there's wheat, there's rice, there's oats, and they all have a different place and a different style. How does the homebrewer kind of cater to keeping that inventory and educating the brewer on what those different grains do and when they might be used?
Well, we try to, if we, we're in this weird in between period right now, right? We have to kind of acknowledge some of that, but I'll sort of talk like it's not existing, right? This sort of coming back onto in store, but the main thing that we try to get like newcomers into is saying, all right, look, there's like 100 grains in here at least, and some of them are called the same thing, and some are similar, and I want you to taste them and understand, you know, so it's like if there's a takeaway of like, just know that there's base malts and specialty malts, and what those are. And then also know that there's name brands for these things. But you know, In-N-Out makes a hamburger, and Five Guys makes a hamburger. They're hamburgers. They're different. Taste them. You decide. You know, it's good to follow recipes as a rule of thumb for how to, you know, make a certain style, but explore a little bit too. And it's kind of interesting because if you went to like allrecipes.com and you found a recipe for making a certain type of pasta, you probably went to the store and then didn't really care what brand of pasta you got, or like the brand of tomato, or like the farm that made it. And you might want to apply a little bit of that as well to the selection of grains at your homebrew store. And instead of saying like, oh, you don't have this specific thing, which we try to carry all the major stuff, but occasionally it's like, oh no, we don't carry that one. We carry this one instead. Be open to it, taste it. Oh, okay, this makes sense, because you're the chef, you're the cook, you're the brewer. So,
what are you looking for when tasting it? What do you mean by?
Yeah, I encourage, like, if someone wanted to come in here, and I don't see it that often, even pre-COVID, you know, and I would just be like, please come in and just open every single bin. On all the bins, there's the name, the origin, a brief description, the type of beer style it's made in, and a percentage that you would typically use, you know, a range, like use 5 to 20% typically, right? And then potential substitutes. If everyone came in here and just like tasted like 2 or 3 kernels, chewed on it, and just thought about like what happened.
Just some black patent malt, just like a whole handful.
Yeah, you got yeah. And you're gonna learn like, whoa, that's really intense. But then that's how you learn, like, okay, if I use this in my recipe, probably don't want to use a lot of this, right? It's like, you know, if you taste cayenne, like, okay, that's pretty intense. So maybe in my recipe, I don't want to use a lot of it. But how do you learn about cayenne? Well, you gotta kind of use it and taste it. So if someone came in here and just spent like an hour just doing that, I'd be like so excited, because that's how I learned, was just standing around the homebrew shop that I worked at prior to this and just tasting everything, and tasting like, why do we have 5 different Pilsner malts? There must be a reason. Let's taste them all, and they're all like subtly different. And same with hops. You know, anytime if you're brewing, even if they came from a package out of the box, like, you know, give them a little rub and smell them, and think about what that is like. At first you may not know what you're looking for, but you know, you do it over time, and you start to build this little catalog, this memory, and I think that's where a lot of your improvement down the road comes in, because as you learn something down the road, this experience that you had tasting this thing a year ago might click in. Or like, oh, that's that. Or as you're tasting beer at other breweries, you'll taste this thing, like, oh, that's like when I put that black patent in my mouth and it was like really ashy and tasted like, you know, an ashtray. I wonder if they're using that or something similar, you know, and that kind of helps just build the whole sort of spider web of beer styles and process.
Yeah, I completely agree. And there's so many geeky levels you can get out there, and so many different varietals out there. And you know, it's quite the rabbit hole when you're talking about just one ingredient there too, right?
Yeah, we even talk about yeast. After I pour a vial of yeast or something, I you know, not before, right? Sanitary, keep it clean. But then after, you know, there's always a little bit of residual, give it a little taste. Or that trube at the end of, you know, emptying out your bucket or your carboy. Taste it. What's it like?
Yeah. One of my favorite stories though is a group of Marines came in, or, you know, being right next to the big Marine base, and I don't know if they'd been to a couple breweries before or whatever, but we had some old pure pitch on the bar, and the guys all daring their friends, you take a shot, shoot it. I said, I'll buy you a beer if you do it. And what do you know? He chugged the whole thing, and it was pretty gross. But understanding, you know, that little dab of yeast is definitely can be beneficial, just like any raw ingredients and materials. Maybe you could touch on milling briefly though, because I think I've heard a lot of old wives' tales when it comes to using the mill at the shop, right? Or pre-milled grain. I can't sit on that for more than a couple days, or the gap at the mill and the shop is just, it's not set up for efficiency because they want you to buy more malt.
Yeah, right.
That extra 50 cents that you'd get, it's just
Yeah.
keeping your lights on.
Yeah, that's how we make our money here. Um, yeah, like fresher is always better, true. And if you have the opportunity to come in and mill it, I think that's great. If you have a mill at home, I think that's great. It gives you a little bit more control over certain things. And I wouldn't say that there's like no such thing as like adjusting mill gap for certain things. But generally speaking, I think you should hopefully be able to trust the mill at your homebrew shop. In our case, we're using, I don't like to argue with people, but when someone's like, is your mill even any good? It's just a homebrew shop. It's like, I have a $3,000 mill. Like, if you want to take it and compare it against your hand crank at home, sure, go ahead. And if it works for you, cool. But like, take a look at the mill. It's this giant thing. But and we check the like visual inspection of the grain on a regular basis, and we try to make it as efficient as possible. I mean, we brew with it too, so we're trying to keep it efficient for that purpose too. And then storing of old grains, we get that question a lot. I always say, if you can mill it, the day before or the day of, cool. If not, it's another thing where you learn to taste it. Like if you have fresh crushed grain, taste it. And then if you want to just set some aside, even just come in and grab 2 ounces and crush it, taste it, and then taste it over the next like week to 5 weeks. You might notice that the flavor, especially if it's in a well sealed bag and it's not like getting moist or anything like that, is probably holding up pretty well. If it starts to taste like a cracker that you left, in an open package on your countertop, well then don't leave your crackers or your cookies in an open package on the countertop. Unless they're Oreos and you like that like slightly oxidized sort of thing, like
weirdly soft.
Yeah, just like a little bit. But it just it comes again to challenging any sort of thing you ever hear. Like, so if someone says like, oh, you can't do that, then at least say like, well, what happens if I do? Maybe there's a way I can sort of challenge that. Maybe I'll just taste it and see what happens.
Yeah, that's a good point. Or maybe it's not a deal breaker for me, right? When
Yeah.
it comes to staling of malt, like that can be a pretty big issue. But if I don't notice a difference between, getting it milled the day before, so a lot of times I'll buy ingredients for 2 batches, and it might take me 5 days in between, 7 days in between to do that, and like that convenience for me is worth any risk of of staling of that malt. And I personally probably wouldn't notice the difference. So I think you're right in that there's the right way to do things, but it's not always the best way to do it, depending on the individual.
Yeah. And for instance, we've had at least in one occasion, I think I could think of 2 specific occasions where someone said, I've had this grain and it's been like a year and I just never got to it. I want to use it. Could I use it? And it's like, well, okay, it's really cheap to buy more grain. Are you okay with, saving $20 for the sake of just experimenting and finding out? Like, I can't tell you exactly what's going to happen with that, but, and in some cases, like, yeah, I don't really care. I'm just going to brew it, just kind of see what happens. And I have it, so I'm going to use it. And they go, cool. That's your answer. I'm just here as like your like life coach at that point. It's like, sounds like you figured out what you want to do. Like I applaud it.
Yeah, we see that on the yeast side quite a bit, right? Like this is way past expiration, and it depends on the first personal philosophy and circumstance. Because for me, I'd rather spend the $8-9 on a new pack to ensure that the 6 hours that I invested in actually brewing it doesn't go to waste. But
fermentation's different though, right? And we'll talk about that, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I treat like the freshness of yeast and malt and hops a little bit differently than the way I treat freshness of yeast.
Yeah, so maybe we could transition to looking at hops, right? This is something that's not uncommon to see, hops that are a couple years old. Unfortunately, the volumes that you're dealing with is probably not as common as on the commercial scale where people are contracting,
Yeah.
a lot of varieties of hops, and changing their brewing schedule quite a bit. But does that matter? How should they be stored? How are you storing them? Are you buying in bulk and then breaking up into more manageable sizes? Or when you go to the supplier, do you just buy a little 2-ounce,
Yeah.
prepackaged?
We do a mix. In the beginning, we almost exclusively bought bulk and then broke it down. And we used vacuum seal initially, and then we switched to bags that would at least protect with UV when it came to hops. And then over the years, as we kind of did the calculations on like the volume we were doing and how long it took, it just kind of became apparent, like, it's a lot easier for us to just buy these increments from like directly from the supplier. Occasionally we'll break them down if like we just can't find any more, in between crop years and packaging. You always run through this kind of ebb and flow of abundance and then scarcity of certain brands. So with the goal of keeping that brand in stock, we have all of our packaging stuff here for those situations, so we can break it down. But it is true, like you mentioned, I think what a lot of homebrewers don't realize too is that like a lot of beer they're drinking from their favorite breweries might be from crop years from 1 or 2 years back, because they bought contracts for a couple 100 pounds of something and maybe didn't use as much of it or something else, and they are they're doing first in first out, so they have if it's 2020 and they still have Simcoe from 2018 from that contract, guess what, they're brewing with that 2018 even though there might be some 2019 hops in their fridge. And sometimes the 2019 crop of that same exact hop isn't as good as the 2018 crop. It's so these things change, so that it's not. So then you get to packaging. Well, at least try to leave it in that original packaging as long as you can. We keep it in our cold box, so it's not frozen. Ideally, if we had a separate freezer, it would be frozen. So we keep it at 34 degrees. And that's the benefit of buying everything now in these smaller packages. We can tell the customer, when possible, we're buying in these smaller packages. And when we can, we order as fresh as possible too. Certain things we try to predict will run out eventually, so we'll buy small packages but in a large quantity. So we'll buy like 100 packs of the 2-ounce, and that's just through the sort of years of experiencing, like, okay, every January or so, right in between the packaging times of harvest is in fall, packaging is happening sometime after that, then it's got to get to our distributors, it's got to get counted, etc. Sometimes we run into these shortages in like December, January, so we might load up a little heavier than usual. So maybe that 1-ounce bag is sitting in its nitrogen purge package longer than normal, but it was still harvested, the year prior too. So it's been sitting there no matter what. So, so it's something that we try to keep in mind, but it's just kind of the way it works.
And have you seen trends when brewers are coming in looking for certain hops? Is it, just always the most obvious where everybody's asking for Citra? Is there an ebb and flow? Is there seasonality to what they're asking for? Are people into these, classic noble hops and hops that we might take for granted, not hear about as much? What's the balance between what people are actually using?
It's such a mix. When we first opened, I basically was like, okay, I'm going to get at least, obviously if like Cascade, Citra, I think Citra was just barely coming out in 2012. I can't remember when it came out, but I'm pretty sure it was around. For those big ones, we're going to get, a lot of those. But then I pretty much bought like 4 ounces at least of like everything in the whole entire catalog, just to have it. And then 4 years later, some of that stuff we threw away because no one had bought a single one of them in 4 years. But then to your other question about, people still for sure are into Saaz, Tettnang, Hallertau, Pearl. I think lager brewing and kind of this, like the old world style of brewing is, like it never went away, but you're definitely seeing more like younger brewers still be into it. It's not just brewers who have been brewing for 20 years who are using these hops. You're seeing younger brewers say, I want to brew a really good Czech Amber or a Schwartz beer or something. And then it is seasonal too. IPA is basically seasonal all year long. So yeah, Citra, Mosaic, Amarillo, and then like the newer varieties, you're gonna see those move pretty much throughout the year. But then in the winter, fall, when people start brewing their porters and their stouts, we see Kent Golding move a lot more and that sort of thing. And then people are always interested in the new thing, but then it's funny. I have this memory of like when Mosaic came out, we couldn't convince people to buy Mosaic. We were like, hey, there's this new thing, Mosaic. It's like the super Amarillo. And they're like, nah, not interested. And then it took like a year and a half to catch on until Carl Strauss released their Mosaic IPA. And then everyone else, and then they're like, oh, can you give me this Mosaic? It's like, yeah, it's been here for the whole time. So it's interesting because sometimes homebrewers are so ahead of the trends and they drive the trends. And then sometimes they wait for the big guys to do it, or the big gals and guys to do it. So it's interesting to see. I definitely know too, like if one of the big publications like Zymergy or Brew Your Own or Craft Beer and Brewing has like a cover story, it's like, all right guys, make sure we order enough stuff for Pilsner because they just did a cover story on Pilsner. So in 2 months, everyone's gonna be talking about Pilsner, and it's pretty good science on that one.
Yeah, that's interesting that those publications are still so relevant, right? Like,
yeah,
I'm still involved with a lot of them and read them monthly and all that, but
absolutely.
Sometimes it's difficult to see, what's actually resonating, right? Like, is that effective? Do people actually care about that? And those publications have done a really good job at remaining relevant and talking about what people should or are excited about. Going back to hops and some of the bigger breweries driving those trends, Citra, I think, is an awesome example, and I'd love to see somebody actually recount that whole story, because for so many years it was so scarce, right? It was really hard to get, and people were, if you didn't have a contract for it, and you basically weren't going to get it, or it was going to be really expensive.
Yep.
And it took a lot of time, and I think some of that scarcity might have been a little intentional on trying not to overgrow, right?
Yeah.
In forecast. And so when a lot of these trends happen, when we're working with agricultural products, there's a big lead time for them to adjust on these trends, and it might take a year, it might take 2 years. And on the yeast side, I think we get scrutinized a lot because people see it as something that should be instant, and we're still talking about 3 weeks a lot of times. And if it's a new trend, well, we have to R&D that might take a month. And so you're talking about a couple months sometimes to get strains to market. But the way,
which is fast, right?
Right. Yeah. But the way people look at yeast a lot is that it should be there yesterday. Why is it not in stock? Right.
Yeah.
But any of these other brewing ingredients and supplies aren't really viewed the same way, which is interesting.
It is. Yeah. Because that hop, like if Mosaic came out in, I don't know, it was the 2013 or 2014 or whatever, probably before that. In 2001, we weren't going like, hey, how come we don't have this Mosaic yet, right? But that strain was already in development. It was already being thought of. It was already working there. But there is a disconnect, just in culture in general, right, between the farming process, or even just like the R&D process within a lab, and production, and then actual like on the shelf.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think if it's like things we wish customers would know is like, hey, know that you're getting into this farming artisanal thing that takes time, and it's like a really beautiful, awesome process. Be open-minded about what that process is, and like ask questions about, well, how long does it take to do this, and look into it just for your own curiosity, because it'll help you adjust and adapt as well.
Mm-hmm. Segueing to yeast, I think the most obvious that's spoken about, aside from strain selection, is, do I need a starter?
Yeah.
Right. How do you guide novice to experienced brewers when they're coming in looking for yeast, Are you asking them their batch size? Are you asking them the gravity? Or are you just saying, here's cal ale, go ahead, and it's probably
Yeah.
going to make a good beer?
Yeah, we always, we definitely ask batch size, gravity. When someone asks like, my first beer, what's the best thing I should brew? That's kind of two part. One, what's the thing you really want to drink? Like, what's your favorite style of beer? What are you most excited about? And then from there, I could say the lower the alcohol and the lower the hop amount, the cheaper the beer will be. And then the lower the alcohol, the easier it will be for your fermentation to be well. Um, and then I just try to warn people, like, if you say double IPA, cool, that's fine, but I'm just going to advise that you either like listen to me and be willing to do this extra step with the starter, or you buy that extra yeast, because I don't think you're going to be as happy with it as you could be if you don't follow up on that. And that took me a long time to really grasp, is the importance of yeast. When the yeast book came out with Jamil and Chris White, reading that, it was just sort of like, oh, these are the things that were happening to my beer, and not the hops and the malt, and all this other stuff. Um, so yeah, learning, and starters can be intimidating. Luckily, there's products like Proper Starter, that like pre-made starter is great, right? There at first,
Just
when I saw
canned
those,
wort, right?
yeah, it's canned wort. It's kind of high concentrate. You dilute it. When I first saw those at homebrew cons, I was like, people are so lazy. They're gonna spend that much money for, and I thought like, no way. But now, we carry them and we sell a lot of them, and it's like, if someone's like, I don't know, I have to boil the DME and then I have to cool it down. It's here, just get this starter. It'll save you the time, and it's really going to pay off for what you're trying to do. And then there's the people who like brew 2.5 or like 3 gallon batches. I kind of wish there was maybe more push in the industry to push people towards that. It makes sense to do 5 gallons for a lot of reasons. Buckets are that size, all that sort of stuff. But if you just did a 2.5 gallon batch of that double IPA, well, now that vial of yeast is a good contender, right, for what you need. So, so that's always something people could play with too.
Yeah, what I've seen with determining scale of brewing, I had a nice big house before moving into a really small apartment, and I still wanted to brew, so I was doing a lot of 1 gallon batches, but the margin of error is so different. 0.2 ounces of hops, in a 1 gallon batch compared to a 5 gallon batch, it's going to show up very different. So I had a lot of difficulty dialing in process with a smaller volume, and look at, the yeast side's kind of the same thing, not being able to cell count and just going based off of volume for the manufacturer. Eyeballing half a pack of yeast is not the easiest thing to do. But yeah, I think that's awesome that there have been easier ways of doing it. When it comes to starters, it's probably the number one homebrew related question that I've gotten over the years, and I think there's a lot of benefit to starters, but I don't always think people understand what that benefit actually is, and the way they equate, I guess something that's like a personal pet peeve is when somebody says, like, kind of like you said, something is better, right? Well, making a starter it's a better fermentation. It's like, well, how are you quantifying that? Well, my airlock started bubbling. It's like, yeah, you had really active yeast and a slightly higher cell count because of that starter, but it's mainly because that yeast was already really active prior to pitching. Your lag time was a lot less because of that. It doesn't necessarily mean it was a better fermentation. Did the beer taste better? It tastes the same. Well, then, to me, it's kind of a moot point, but I think there are obviously a lot of benefits for it, especially when you're talking about those bigger beers and the costs associated with that, for sure. But I encourage everybody to read the yeast book and try to understand it, at least from a big picture perspective of, what's actually happening, and is it better? Because if you can save time and money by not doing that process, maybe that's great, but maybe that's why we're not into homebrewing too. Or maybe that, you know what I mean? I think a lot of people like that step and that ritual of, well, the day before I got to get this started and going, and it's something I can look at and it's visual and it's tangible. Right. And it's part of making it a weekend, as opposed to, just doing extract and spending a 15-minute boil and then adding your yeast and being done brewing within an hour and a half. And I think a lot of those all-in-one brewing systems, which I know you have a lot of experience for, is something I've toyed around a lot with. Like, should I buy one of those? It would save me a lot of time personally, and I'd be able to brew more, but that's not the process. Is what I enjoy. It's not necessarily the beer.
Yeah. And I was wondering, what is your your standard answer if somebody asks you, when should I make a yeast starter? Like, how many days in advance?
24 to 48 hours.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
I ideally not cooling and decanting, like that's, fine. But I think if you're adding it when it's still very active is most beneficial for speed.
Yeah. Yeah, because we definitely get a lot of concern over not wanting to add that 2 liters of liquid to their 5-gallon batch.
Mm-hmm.
And I can understand where they're coming from. But it's another one of those things where I try to say, well, maybe just try it this time and see if you really notice the difference. It's difficult for homebrewers too, because a lot of times homebrewers are brewing one batch one time, and then they're moving through, and then maybe eventually they start repeating things. It's more common to find a homebrewer who just kind of has a little bit more like style ADD. They're like, I just want this and this and this and this. As compared to the homebrewer that will find that, we had one regular who just the other day was like, this is batch number 48 of this ESB.
Mm-hmm.
And you're like, wow, I bet that ESB is amazing, right?
Yeah, I feel like I know who you're talking about.
Yeah, like they that must be so dialed in,
Yeah, and it's always the retired engineers, right?
Yeah, yeah. And so for them, they have that advantage of they can see what happens if, hey, this time what happens if I just pour the 2 liters of that starter on top, because I've already tasted this beer a few times, so I know. And usually I say you're probably not going to tell a difference, honestly. But so I just kind of want to get your take on that.
Yeah. I don't think it impacts, as much as people think it does, but it is something to consider, right? And I think most importantly is, if you like the end result, not changing more than one variable per beer, whether it's the same beer, same style or whatever, like keeping that process as similar as possible, and then tweaking a couple things, because it's really easy to start changing things off the cuff. And for the first like 5 years that I brewed at home, I was really guilty of it, because it's like, oh, I have an extra half an ounce of hops in this, let me just throw it in anyways. And more is better, right? It just always seemed like, let me just do more, let me throw more in there. And my beers admittedly were never that great. And in the last couple of years, when I've slowed down a little bit and actually scheduled out what my brew day looks like and what my times should be and what I can do in advance and what I have to do post boil, beer quality's been greatly improved. And it's not a change in equipment, it's just a change in mindset, experience, and mentality.
Yeah, which is a good segue.
Yeah. And we were talking about this offline a little bit, but extract, I think, is just one of those things that people have always explained all grain brewing as the next step, right? This is what you do when you want to be a better brewer. And in my experience, I think that's what you want to do when you want to understand the process more.
Yeah.
And when you want to have more, when you want to be able to put your fingerprint on it a little bit, all grain lends that, right? You can tweak the percentages of the grains a little bit easier. You can change your mash temperature, and adjust the way that beer finishes out. You can, but I think with extract, there's a lot of high quality beers out there, and I think people would be surprised if presented blind with a lot of these beers and how easy they are to make.
Yeah. Yeah, I think the you have like the classic. I can always tell when a beer is extract, and that I
Extract
had that.
twang, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
it just has this little thing in there. And I've learned, through the process of deciding for myself that, we're going to touch on this, but that I wanted to go through the beer judge certification program. I wanted to read tasting beer. I wanted to go through the Cicerone program, so that I could improve my brewing, because I'm giving we're going to say this later too. I'm giving my beer to my friends. They're like, it's great. And I'm like, I know it's not as good as this AleSmith that I'm also drinking. So I need to start learning. I need to kind of take this on my own a little bit. And through that process of actually tasting controlled, doctored samples of beer and tasting these off flavors, I started to learn, that extract twang might honestly just be acetaldehyde combined with a little bit of chlorophenol, because I wasn't filtering my water at all. And so we've tested this theory several times with brew demos here, where we'll brew same exact recipe, all grains, same exact recipe, extract. For the all grain one, we'll do the old, first timer method of just like, I'm going to shake it a little bit, dump in the yeast, no temperature control, see how that goes. And, you make a beer, it's pretty good. And then for the extract one, we'll do I'm going to use oxygen stone. I'm going to give it like a 45-second burst of oxygen, yeast nutrients, and then it's going to get perfect fermentation temperature control. And we're going to do like an actual like cell count, or at least like an ideal sort of cell count pitch for that one. And guess what? It's a better beer. And then, or at least equal to, right? And we've tried different recipes, and we've had kind of, a little balancing act between those two, but it usually, it definitely serves the point of like, it's the extract itself isn't the problem. If you have really old liquid extract, there, of course, there's always mileage varies. Liquid extract tends to, oxidize pretty quickly. So I tend to just favor dry malt extract for myself if I'm using it, or if I'm doing a demo or anything like that. It has its own quirks. If the steam hits it, it's really annoying to get the, but you adapt, you learn the tips and tricks on that. But I would say that's one of the definite things that I try to like get into people, is like, you might feel like you really have to get to all grain to be a real brewer, or like you don't get the respect, or you don't have the chops. But that's really just false. I think you should really try to challenge that narrative, because I don't think it's really true. Fermentation is really what makes beer. And if someone had told me, I don't know if I would have listened, but I kind of wish somebody would have just said, hey, all right, you researched how to like build a mash tun, and the kettle you need, and you're going to go buy that floor burner. So you've got like $250 just burning a hole in your pocket, right? Don't do that. Go buy a little mini fridge, or like something that's going to help you with fermentation temperature. Go buy a stir plate, buy, Erlenmeyer flask, start making starters, get an oxygen or aeration system, put all that money towards that. And I wish I would have, I wish someone would have just been like, no, stop what you're thinking, and just focus on fermentation. Because it wasn't until 2 years later, after making consistently just like kind of whatever beer, that I read that yeast book and was like, oh, okay, I got to go back to this.
Yeah, I think that's what a lot of people's journey looked like, right?
Yeah.
And it's great to be part of that change now, right? Like learning from our experiences, and trying to, show the importance of, again, I just think it comes down to like what's big and flashy, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like if you're just starting out brewing, it's kind of boring just to buy something that your fermenter sits in and you don't really touch and don't really do anything with. But being able to, get your mash paddle and start moving that around.
Yeah, it is fun. I love brewing on all grain, right?
Yeah, and like just in watching those additional transfers and loudering, and it's just, it seems a lot more fun, and so I understand why I wanted to jump into that, and why everybody else does too. But if you're looking at the quality of beer, that's probably not the best initial investment, which is a really simple way to put it, which I've never really thought about before. So kind of talking about that a little bit more, the ability to control temperature being important. I would argue that the overwhelming majority of flawed beer, both homebrew and commercially, aside from oxidation, stems from fermentation derived, undesirable flavor.
Absolutely.
And it's not always the easiest to describe or pinpoint and takes a lot of time, but I think, I'm volunteering you up to try a bunch of faulty beer, but I think that's where local homebrew shops really provide benefit of having that experience.
Yeah, absolutely. Like on the slide there, the importance of that temperature control. We've touched on that. It is extremely important. And again, just go to those books. How to brew, yeast, brewing classic styles, and find, read for yourself those reasons why it's really important, right? We can go on and on and on. But sorry, I got sidetracked there trying to talk about the importance of temperature control. But bring me back on track. What the hell were we talking
about? We're talking about temperature control and identifying maybe why that's important, because I think
and tasting, bringing beers to homebrew stores, right?
Yeah. And reading about it's one thing, but being able to bounce ideas off somebody and try something with somebody, or if you have the ability to work with spikes, but see, those are difficult for one person or two people. So having a communal hub for that, I think, is really important, because I would say half of off flavors that you commonly read about, I perceive a little bit different, and I've learned to communicate those using the standard butter, butterscotch, green apple, but the way that it resonates with me and the way I taste it isn't necessarily I jump out and say one of those flavors. I've learned how to process that and then verbalize it in a standardized language that everybody understands. But without going through that and being able to try and talk it through with people, if you're sitting in a bubble by yourself, it's I would argue almost impossible to really educate yourself on those.
Yeah, it is. And it's same with anything, like reading it and finding those resources is good so that you know where to find the information when you're looking for it. But yeah, really experiencing it with other people is really where a lot of that, like, I think, at least for me, that process really sticks. And I have similar problems. We've talked about certain things with off flavors that, green apple is like the standard thing for acetaldehyde. I just like, if I think of acetaldehyde, I'll use the word, like you said, green apple, but for me, it's pumpkin guts with a little bit of latex paint. And then I go, oh yeah, okay, green apple. Now I kind of get it. But yeah, it's definitely true. Like we all kind of process things a little differently. So it's acknowledging that. And when it comes to bringing stores into your homebrew store, or beers into your homebrew store to try, we're always happy to do it. Sometimes we're really busy, so it's like, okay, not the time, but we'll try to get to it later. Or it's nice when we can do it with the customer. But being open, and we always try to be a little cautious with like, oh, this is great. Try to be encouraging first, right? Even as a beer judge, your job is to encourage this person to keep brewing beer, right? I can point out things, but in that comment section, I always try to keep it positive, even if it's like I can name 10 wrong things with this. What are the one or two things that I can like kind of gently bring up that will just, like, if they just do that, this beer is going to be 5 points, 10 points better. And so same thing with when people you try to gauge people, like how much do they actually want to know? But so if you are bringing it in, you really push, and don't lead with like, this beer sucks, I want you to know. Just like lead with like, hey, I brewed this beer, I would love for you to try it. Let them try it. And then say like, okay, so this is my process. Bring your notes in, take notes of your process, etc. But I might be getting ahead of myself. But
no, that definitely helps a lot though, right? Because where it's like if you have some undesirable flavors that seem fermentation derived, the first question that we're going to ask is, what temperature did you ferment it? Was it temperature controlled?
Yeah.
And a lot of people, not so much in San Diego, but the rest of the country, are fortunate with basements and stuff where it's like, well, my basement's at 66, so that's cool. That's awesome. Yeah. But a lot of times it's like, well, I fermented at between these two temperatures, because my garage or my my laundry room fluctuates depending on
Yeah.
if the dryer's going or not.
Yeah.
And
So it's
you
like
know,
bucket of water will at least keep control. You could swap out ice packs, at least for the first 3 to 4 days. Right.
right. And that's the question too, is like, okay, say it went between 65 and 75, 77 degrees.
Mhm.
Well, at what point in the fermentation was it 77 degrees? Was it
Yeah.
77 degrees at day 5? Probably not as much of an issue.
Yeah.
But if it's sitting at 75 the first 48 hours, then that's probably where some of these flavors came from.
Yeah.
But we got a couple more minutes, and we've definitely been talking about faults and how to diagnose them. But one thing that I personally I don't like the phrase off flavors. I prefer undesirable flavors or attributes, because
Mhm.
it's so much more broad than the list of diacetylaldehyde,
Oh yeah.
sulfur, DMS, and also when people are learning about those faults, they learn about them in the same, as if they all have the same severity, and they're always going to show up at the same level.
Yeah.
And in my case, like DMS, for example, I've found very, very few examples of DMS like in finished beers.
Yeah.
Like it's there, it's possible, but it's not nearly as common as, say, acetaldehyde, right?
Yeah.
And even different levels and different personal thresholds, or the style that it's in, all varies too. I would argue that more often you see some of those basic flavors that are different. The beer might be overcarbonated, might be undercarbonated. The balance might be off due to bitterness and sweetness, and I think that's something that doesn't get enough attention in conversation as it probably should.
Yeah, I think you touched on that balance thing, and in the beer styles class, I kind of like try to lay out for the whole 8 weeks that like every beer is the same, and the only thing that makes this one different than this one is the balance between the main components. And there's little offshoots and stuff like that, but balance is huge. And so when it comes to homebrew and recipes, a lot of times when I'm judging a flight, it really comes down to balance. And even if it's like, yeah, I know you wanted to get more hop character, you wanted this big thing in there, but your balance is off, and now this thing isn't refreshing and drinkable. And I think you can achieve anything you want to do. It could be a 12% whatever with big everything, but if it's balanced within that, then it's going to be a good experience for the consumer. It can be 4% and totally out of balance and suck. It doesn't matter. So balance and learning those, like what is bitterness? What is sweetness? Carbonation's a big thing, especially for beginning brewers. So just try to stick to a consistent schedule for from fermentation day to when you actually package it. That's going to help you dial in that carbonation level, because it's a moving target. And then as far as identifying diacetyl, acetaldehyde, sulfur, get 10 people together and get that Cicerone off flavor kit, or go to the bjcp.org website and download their study guide, and they have like a 1 or 2 page sort of how to make your own sort of off flavor experience at home thing, like on the cheap. It gets people together and try it out, or let your Bud Light warm up and get all that isoamyl acetate and acetaldehyde.
Or come hang out at your homebrew shop and some of the classes that you all have previously done. Hopefully, towards the end of summer and through the end of the year, you can start doing those again, because I think those were an awesome resource, like not even just for your customers, but just we've sent a lot of people over the years. Anytime you've done those, because it just it's, again, I just think that resource is really important, and you have to, the way I've always learned is through conversation and hands-on learning. And I think when we're talking about tasting, that's very critical.
Yeah.
And in that same vein, like you said, beer judge certification program, like San Diego's very active when it comes to homebrewing in general.
Yeah.
But we have a lot of clubs to offer. Make your own club. Go online, find a Facebook group or Reddit, and try to find homebrewers in your area that just want to meet up make it fun, make it dumb. Like
Yeah.
that's,
And the BJCP, again, great resource, because they have like basically an outline for a 10-week study course. So your homebrew club could just start with, all right, the first, week 1 is like, all right, when are we going to get together? And then the next 10 weeks could be, here's the beers we should buy to taste, and here's the lessons for the study guide for the whole day. And they really lay it out, and all the resources are there. They tell you where to go. So use that if you don't know where to start, just go to BJCP and start.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, so if you have to form your own club, that's where I go. Or join a club. It took me so long to join a club, and as soon as I did, I was like, man, I really should have done this. I was intimidated that I wouldn't fit in, or that people would make fun of my beer, or that I wasn't good enough. And then I got there, and I was like, wow, there's such a wide range of brewing skill and experience here. I fit right in, and people are welcoming. And if people aren't welcoming, then start your own club and be welcoming.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, it's not even really about the beer at a certain point, right?
Yeah.
Just passionate, like-minded people.
Yep.
As you mentioned earlier, just the takeaways, I think, from this casual conversation is just understanding that your friends will always praise free beer. So I think the theme of everything we've spoken about is how to make better beer, and really understanding your ingredients and process. Experimenting, having fun with it. I guess you touched on a little bit, but documentation is probably what I would argue is the most important, because if you like or don't like something, being able to repeat it over time, that documentation maybe doesn't matter as much once you've done it a lot. But those first couple batches, I think, are super important to be able to reference. But at the end of the day, if you like drinking it, that's really what matters. It's not for somebody else, it's for you and your friends. So if that's who's enjoying it, it doesn't matter if it would score a 20 or a 45 at a homebrew competition. So just taking it with a grain of salt a little bit, because scores don't always equate to quality of the beer either. And then most importantly, using your local homebrew shop as a sounding board and resource is probably the best way to make better beer. Where can people find you, George?
Homebrewingco.com.
Well,
so we've kind of switched all the naming over to just Homebrewing Co. for the shop and for the beer side. Just put it all into one place. And we're working on continuing with videos and trying to build up more resources there. So people are always welcome to hit us up there. So Homebrewing Co. on the Instagrams, or on Facebook, or on .com.
Awesome. Well, it was great seeing you, and hopefully we can grab a beer sooner than later.
Yeah.
Definitely let me know next time you're by here picking up a yeast order too, and I'll send you home with a bunch of stuff.
Cool. Well, thanks for everyone who joined and who watches in the future, and thanks for having me.
Yeah, thank you all, and we'll see you soon. Cheers.